Welcome to this webinar in the webinar series of the SSH network related to IPBES, or the Social Sciences and Humanities Network, organized by Maria, Marla, and myself. And today we have this presentation that we've been really looking forward to by Professor Andrew Church from the University of Brighton and Dr. Robert Fish from the University of Kent, titled Values, Non-Human Agency and the Anthropocene, Arts, Humanities, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Research in the UK. I can just say very shortly first. So Andrew Church is Professor of Human Geography and also Associate Pro Vice Chancellor of Research and Enterprise at the University of Brighton. And we have Robert Fish, who is Reader in Human Ecology and also Deputy Director at the Division of Human and Social Sciences at the School of Anthropology and Conservation at the University of Kent. And I believe they will introduce themselves a bit more during the presentation. So with this, I welcome Andrew and Rob to take the floor here.
Thank you. Yeah, hello everybody. Welcome. I think this will be actually a long introduction to ourselves and our work. I mean, this presentation is an introduction into what, in many respects, Andrew and I have been up to for many years, and it's a wonderful opportunity, if I've understood well the purposes of your network, which is to try to build capacity for the social science and humanities. I should say from the start that I'm a social scientist by training and have a serious interest in interdisciplinary working, but also really wish to assert the importance of the social science and arts humanities more broadly into the kind of discussions and issues you're seeking to address through your network. So this is a great pleasure to really, in a sense, tell us a story about the way in which we've tried to create a context or receptive context for the social sciences, but more specifically today the arts and humanities in relation to agendas for value in nature and ones which are being propagated through frameworks which are being developed in IPBES and most notably the ecosystem services framework. So we're going to tell a story about how we've done it, or not just how we've done it, me and Andrew, but also what we've observed in a sense, as I suppose the great benefit we've had is we've watched the sweep of changes that have gone on in the UK policy and science scene, and we've been able to observe the ways in which the arts humanities have gradually been able to assert their influence in these areas. And so I just want to begin with the first slide, and then I'm going to just say some opening premises, which I think probably we can, I hope, well maybe not, we all agree with. And I'm going to hand over to Andrew, who's going to just say some of the not the prehistory, but the first part of the story about how this sort of agenda has evolved in the UK science policy area, and then I'll pick up and say how that's been more broadly advanced in new developments, more recent developments, and we'll have some closing thoughts around that. So I just want to begin by making some opening premises and of course to say what I think we can all agree on, that we've got these frameworks which are harmonizing diverse areas of resource management, ecosystem services, natural capital frameworks, nature's contribution to people, and that harmonization process quickly in the narrative around those frameworks, they presume interdisciplinarity, don't they? That harmonization, integration, although there's a kind of unification of languages which actually often can flatten that disciplinary diversity, there is nonetheless the assumption that this harmonization process and the kind of conceptual frameworks we develop are presuming interdisciplinarity. And I think the story, the sort of theoretical story or the conceptual story, for those who I'm sure many of us are familiar, is that those harmonizing attempts are have their provenance particularly in natural science and And so that construction of interdisciplinarity starts from, you know, in broad terms, from the natural sciences moving outwards, and almost like expanding in steps. And so, you know, the articulation of an interdisciplinary world in which social sciences and humanities can pass through, you know, starts from that sort of premise of the natural science view of what interdisciplinary might involve. And I think that often comes from a view that, you know, natural science, or many aspects of natural science, are actually quite fundamentally limited, and they may be very powerful, but we realize that many of the sort of challenges we face are, and which might be conceived as scientific problems, are of course wrapped up in social issues, cultural questions, political conundrums. and so as we move outwards and we see that that our science can't answer the kind of questions, or has to pass through other processes, then of course this adds weight to, or it creates the preconditions for strong statements about the need for interdisciplinarity. And of course the story of these frameworks, you know, particularly the ecosystem services framework, is one in a sense of like I would say sort of a number of sort of revolutions in thought, and maybe we're moving towards the fourth revolution. The first one would be the emergence of these frameworks from ecology, then the marriage of ecology to various ideas of economics, into the third revolution, I would say, of build into the wider social sciences, the psychology, the geographers, and I think we are in the sort of the fourth revolution, conceptual revolution, which is the movement out to the arts and humanities. It is, in a sense, the feeling that we've missed there's a paradigmatic step that we need to take that introduces all of these great virtues of the arts humanity, which is emphasizing the qualifying nature of our assessments, the interpretive nature of problems, and the resistance or suspicion or critical engagement with any kind of frameworks that try to draw a straight line between 2 points, or being incredibly too technocratic. And I think arts and humanities become, certainly in my experience, a sort of byword for asserting a more interpretive and qualifying view of these harmonizing ambitions, which are often rooted in this natural science. I think at the same time as that, we always, I certainly have observed, and I think Andrew would probably say the same, that I think the invitation which is there is a sort of almost like a reluctant invitation, in that, you know, it can be seen as a little bit troubling, and perhaps inviting risk and uncertainties because of those harmonizing frameworks, because those frameworks work with certain sort of ontological and epistemological assumptions that, although they can presume interdisciplinarity, they might be a bit nervous by what that actually may mean for those frameworks. And so I think there's always a sort of challenge in the background, and I think there are other challenges in that. You know, I think, you know, my experience is the arts humanities have always been almost seen like a mysterious black box, best sort of left alone. And if it is sort of opened up, it's treated in a quite simplified way, particularly, and I suppose most notably, the idea that the arts and humanities broadly defined are effectively about decorating more official forms of knowledge. So they have this sort of decorative function rather than critical function, which is the sort of thing I would say we obviously have to resist and push against. But nonetheless, of course, the idea that, you know, as we expand these frameworks and expand our interdisciplinary pretensions, the idea of the arts, humanities, and also the social sciences somewhat as being kind of translators of these and communicators of more complex information is obviously very, very, very powerful first point that many people make. Nonetheless, I think there are some problems, or some serious problems, with that kind of model. And of course, what we're trying to develop here, and what I think we've witnessed somewhat in the UK, is that we're trying to see the arts humanities as providing new models of evidence, new vocabularies and ways of qualifying and contextualizing ideas such as valuation, and perhaps creating context for research which is actually transdisciplinary in intent and actually may garner new or provide new models for environmental citizenship and environmental engagement. So I think there's a lot of sort of potential there, but I say that as a sort of opening point. You know, that's my sort of settled view of the sort of the overall sort of challenge. As it turns out, and we will say the sort of the dynamics of story as it's involved in the UK, I think the thing that's happened is the arts humanities the science policy arena has been receptive to the arts humanities, because I think it's started increasingly talked about culture, and you know, culture has been a kind of word that has been essentially an invitation to the arts humanity to move into this space, because obviously the arts humanities engage with questions of culture and interpretations of cultural texts, and have theories and ideas of culture, which in a sense these wider frameworks need. And of course the question of values, and the idea of values is again a serious invitation to the arts humanities, not only to be sort of drawn in, but to pay attention to these areas of science policy innovation which might seem to be outside of their scope or hardly ever noticed. So I think culture and values has been almost like the Trojan horse of the arts humanities, certainly in the UK. So I'm going to hand over now to Andrew, who's going to say some words about some of the sort of the early part of the story.
Okay, thanks, Rob. I won't take control, I'll let you move the slides on. So if you want to go on to the next slide, I don't want to take technical risks of taking control, so leave it to you. I think what we'll do now is really tell a story that Rob and I have been involved in for the last 10 years around the development of the ecosystem services approach and the various processes and devices and activities we've taken part in to try and develop the arts and humanities and non-economic social science perspectives in the ecosystem service approach. And as Rob said, I think what will follow now is a justification for some of those opening premises that Rob made, and our claim of using culture and values almost as a Trojan horse to get arts and humanities perspectives in particular into the ecosystem service approach. And where this really started for Rob and I was having to develop a conceptual framework for the cultural ecosystem services for the UK National Ecosystem Assessment that was completed in 2011, and then a series of projects called the National Ecosystem Assessment Follow-On that were published in 2014, which we were heavily involved in as lead authors and principal investigators. So in the UK context, the ecosystem services approach grew out of science, had already, I would argue, before the National Ecosystem Assessment in the UK, engaged economics and psychology, particularly through international studies. And what we were part of in developing the National Ecosystem Assessment was trying to bring in non-economic social science, geography, anthropology, but also the arts and humanities, and arguing that cultural ecosystem services as a concept required some counter-invention in social science theory, and for the scientists in the ecosystem assessment was typically viewed as non-compliant, which meant difficult to measure and exceptional, and somehow put in its own categories and seen as separate and non-material. Rob and I heavily arguing that separation between material and non-material was not helpful. So the National Ecosystem Assessment was completed, and pleasingly that led on to the funding of a series of follow-on packages in which we were really able to draw the arts and humanities in particular into the ecosystem services approach in the UK, particularly by drawing in alternative methodologies to valuation and the interpretive perspectives of the humanities. Now, there were 10 work packages. WPR stands for work package, and 3 of them in that blue box are really where this happened, over research into the values of coastal marine ecosystem services, cultural ecosystem services, and then a whole work package on shared plural and cultural values that involve people like Mike Christie, Jasper Kentner, who've continued that through into ITBE's work on values as well. But look at the top 3. The top 3 were the continuation of the economic, what Rob and I would see the dominance of economics as the social science perspective in UK ecosystem service assessment. However, and if we go on to the next one, Rob, a bit like this network, we were given funding to really try and develop the arts and humanities perspectives. And where the funding came from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK to set up a working group to develop perspectives on cultural ecosystem services from an arts and humanities perspective. And we looked at the contributions of individual subjects areas to the ecosystem service approach. So environmental ethics and aesthetics, ecolinguistics, religion and spirituality, creative expression, storytelling, and history and narrative. And we particularly identified digital cultural mapping as a key area, because of course that spoke quite strongly to the scientists and to the economists, because this was a way of adding a numerical dimension to the arts and humanities. But whilst we saw it as keystone, those others above were seen as equally important. Now, I'll just end by saying we produced a large report, 30 people contributing to it. We didn't call it a systematic review like we might do now, but it was a very wide-ranging review of the literature. And here are our three key observations, which are actually somewhat embarrassing. Now we've had ITBES's engagement with indigenous and local knowledge and the whole decolonising agenda. Because actually these observations are all based on a reading of the English language literature. What of course ITBES has taught me is there are other literatures out there, particularly Hispanic literature, which meant we might have made slightly different observations if we'd engaged with that in 2014. But our conclusions was the concept of environmental humanities was more advanced in North America and Australasia than in particular in the UK. In Europe, we felt it was a less familiar notion, but you had the very strong institutes, Rachel Carson, KTH, Environmental Humanities Laboratory in Stockholm. In the UK, the environmental humanities was just beginning to appear on the scholarly landscape. And what Rob will show you is it has really taken off. And I think this working group was part of pushing that agenda forward. And so we did try and establish in 2014 a future agenda, which is the next slide, Rob, which is interesting in terms of the progress we've made. What we felt had to happen was we had to question the humanistic assumptions at the core of the arts and humanities itself, and the dominance of human-based perspectives on nature. And that meant we had to examine our commonalities through arts and humanities approaches with other species to enrich our sense of who we are as humans. In other words, pushing for a much more relational perspective on nature-human relations. Another agenda we set out, which hasn't been advanced so far, is to investigate the ways in which language inherits and often reinforces conventional oppositions. We've done a little bit of lexicographical computer-based work for the National Ecosystem Assessment that we wanted to continue to understand the ways different communities engage with language around nature, whether it's the media, everyday life, academia. That probably hasn't been so developed, but the first two have, as Rob will show. So I think in about 2014-15, we were quite optimistic. But of course, this is not some neat linear step story. So as the next slide shows, of course, the science economics narrative is still very strong and probably has reasserted itself in the last few years, particularly through the Natural Capital Initiative that follows on from our government's Natural Capital Committee and brings together natural capital professionals, and this is their words there, to grow a collaborative network that ensures sound natural capital science informs public policy and business decisions. And a key part of that process of developing natural capital perspectives has been a very recent report on the economics of biodiversity in the UK, produced by Lord Dasgupta for our Treasury, that, as it says there in its own words, sets out the ways in which we should account for nature in economics and decision making. So economic discourses and narratives are still very, I would argue, dominant in terms of how we think about ecosystem services. And both the Natural Capital Initiative and the economics of biodiversity do see themselves as continuing the ecosystem service approach in the UK. However, at the same time, and this is why it's not a neat narrative story, we've benefited from some of the issues we were promoting back in 2000 and 2014 being pushed forward by ITBES. So here's an ITBES slide about nature's contributions to people. I was a coordinating lead author for the Europe and Central Asia study, and very involved in developing this classification of nature's contributions to people, that I think Rob and I were very pleased to see the way it addressed the need not to always distinguish between material and non-material contributions to people, and the need for more relational rather than instrumental perspectives of the relationship between nature's contributions to people and quality of life. So these two stories of the arts and humanities interpretive agenda being pushed forward alongside the economic agenda come together quite neatly in IPBES. But I think, well, what Rob will now talk about is how the arts and humanities have been embedded more in the ecosystem service approach at the same time as IPBES was developing its approach. So Rob, back to you.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrew. It's lovely retelling this story, you know. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's very interesting that, you know, when you look at the nature's contribution to people, the sort of the language of relational values has been asserted. I mean, when we were developing the National Ecosystem Assessment, particularly its follow-on work, we started employing this is 2014. We started employing the idea of relation and a relational approach, even though we suspected it wasn't really the import of that wasn't sort of fully understood. And what you see in these frameworks a number of years later is the strong assertion of that idea, and actually being part of the sort of evidence gathering sort of dimensions of these sort of resource management frameworks. I mean, it's quite clear that there is some element of parallel tracks that has gone on in the UK, and a sort of certain re-entrenchment of an economic perspective by way of terms like natural capital. So I think it's no surprise in the UK that ecosystem services has been increasingly substituted with the word natural capital as almost like a re-entrenchment of a certain kind of science which you can measure. And I think that natural capital shift hasn't exactly helped, in a sense, sort of propagate these more sort of relational understandings of things. But nonetheless, what you can see from that initial investment in this national ecosystem, it really kind of created the sort of conditions for a wider exploration of the valuation of nature, in which the arts and humanities perspective has sort of increasingly sort of loom large. It's been increasingly emphasized within that framework, and I think that relational understanding, or the people's use of a relational perspective, I think it's been helpful, because it's sort of orientated sort of people subtly in a philosophically different direction, that the idea that, you know, processes and things like in nature arise out of these interactions with people, and that they're actively sort of culturally constructed. And I think that relational perspective has been helpful as a word or as an idea for us within our community, because I think the idea of the relation sort of emphasizes the immediacy of people's experiences and interactions with non-human nature. So it invites considerations of meaning rather than information. I mean, you could argue that a lot of these frameworks chase information. They chase information, they get more and more information and less meaning out of them. And I think the relational perspective invites this consideration of meaning, because it's focused on the immediacy of interactions that occur between people and this non-human nature. And I think that has been very, very important. In any case, what we see as this agenda has developed in the UK is that an arts humanities element has been essentially a common and increasingly required component of any kind of funding proposal. So if you think of the UK landscape as a series of research funders, those funders develop strategic priorities in conjunction with government, and, you know, convene communities of scholarship into those. And in that process of convening in that, the sort of the precondition is that you know, to involve an arts humanities element has been, you know, very, very important. And what we see is a sort of institutional dynamic actually going on in the UK funding landscape, in that the arts and humanities has actually always been it's never been as obviously as wealthy as the other research councils. And, you know, so what it's done is effectively partnered in and created this kind of this lock on proposals to have these arts and humanities components in areas which are seen to be investing in core science. And this is a decisive maneuver that has happened in the UK funding landscape, that you have effectively a kind of financially weaker area of the sort of the research landscape pulling in its perspective via the science and becoming the natural science and becoming a sort of condition in which funding occurs. And that has been a very, very important dynamic. It's most clearly manifested in the Value in Nature program. If you look up Value in Nature on the web, you'll see this as a funded program with many resources. The UK Research Council gave 6.5 million in light of the success of the national ecosystem assessment to understand better and what they said represent the complexity of the natural environment in valuation analysis and decision making, which is quite a tricksy thing to say, but what that really meant was recognizing the complexities of multidisciplinary perspective and a serious invitation to invite alternative or certainly more than monetary views of sort of value in nature. And so the Value in Nature program has been essentially a major venue where, although it was sort of started and sort of pushed by this sort of strong economic focus, the debate really just shifted into the sort of social science and in particularly the wider arts and humanities, dimension. So this has been a kind of crucial venue in the UK, funded by this arts humanities lock into a strategic investment in interdisciplinary work. We've had in that program a number of, as a result of that, a number of major projects, and these are essentially sort of large, £1.5 million projects, which are essentially assembling these multidisciplinary teams and having this strong arts and humanities component. Now, the particular focus of that program was following themes such as health and well-being, mitigation, exposure of people to potential pathogenic presences in water. It had various sort of science themes to it, but the activity, in the sense of the structure of the activity, the point was that these were meant to be going beyond their technocratic framing, and that meant that all of these are 3 examples of projects funded under the program. But these projects have different kind of mixes of the arts and humanities in them, whether you're talking about historical, cultural studies or specific forms of arts practice, painting, photography, sculpture, design, creative writing, all ways of engaging with values-based research in an arts humanities from an arts and humanities vantage point. I think the interesting thing that we've learned, and as these things were originally sort of funded, is that they were still very conventionally sort of science-led. I mean, it's quite clear that the configuration of projects which have arts and humanities components in an interdisciplinary sphere, they can be done in different ways. I mean, you can have science-led collaboration, which has been the sort of typical model. And I think to some extent the initial program, when we got it funded, was it still to sort of presume that science-led, and it sort of willed in the arts and humanities to almost to act out their part in a maybe a kind of modest way to some extent. And then you have the projects which are actually more actively about collaboration and co-design. And so they're essentially about framing questions from these sort of different disciplinary starting point. And I think the program went so far into that, and you'll see evidence. There was evidence of projects which were stronger in that strong emphasis on co-design of projects right from the start, and actually creating models of knowledge production which are pushing against that model that sort of science defines the problem, and then the arts humanities are sort of pushing as sort of translators and communicators of information sort of later on in a project. We never in the Value in Nature program got to arts-led collaborations, right? So the idea of an arts-led project where you would be therefore entertaining quite different epistemologies, if not ontologies, in terms of thinking about projects, and to build from those premises and those starting principles, I think for me is almost like the holy grail. It would be like the model of research or knowledge production, which would temper some of these ingrained views about how you put projects together. But I think you can certainly see with the Value in Nature program evidence of collaborative work with research across the natural sciences, arts, social sciences, and economics only having a certain sort of kind of role in terms of configuring what that social science and humanities component of these debates actually looks like. So we had funded projects that went so far, I think, in innovating. In that program, we've specifically encouraged opportunities for people to move out of different settings, to learn from different disciplinary contexts from work, to actually understand and actually confront different perspectives. That means, for instance, enabling arts and humanities researchers to work within policy settings that they might not all otherwise do. So, for instance, I put here on the slide a placement we had where an arts and humanities researcher worked with the sort of heritage policy body in the UK to think about how the historic significance of parks and gardens actually influences decisions about the preservation and management of the natural environment, and, you know, the historic significance of these landscapes are actually very, very important in terms of the sort of the fabric of the city and how it's managed and how people assemble around that. So really trying to integrate and almost start again from first principles, you know, how we think about the management of a parkland landscape by these kind of placement options, but also turning things around where natural scientists would be placed in settings which are effectively more interpretive in their orientation. And so that kind of mix of confronting different kind of communities and knowledge through this sort of placement process, these were short placements, has been really, really quite helpful in creating sort of policy and practice notes about how you foster these processes of cross-disciplinary learning, and also foster distinctively arts and humanities perspective within policy and scientific discussions. We also, and I think this has been a crucial development as we've gone on in that arts and humanities journey, the programme very much sort of funded, I suppose, embryonic networks, which have since gone on to fund around specifically asserting the arts and the role of the artists in interdisciplinary research. And this has been, in a sense, one of the key gains of the Value in Nature programme as it's developed, is we've sought to emphasise the visual, performing and literary arts in terms of their importance in developing, experiencing, appreciation of landscapes, and recognising that, you know, many projects, you know, and public infrastructure projects often have art-based elements which are actually influencing the way in which the environment is managed. And so what we try to do is conceptualize that the nature and expand understanding of the nature of that contribution that the arts can make. So we held a major event at in the National Gallery, which convened essentially a group of artists, practitioner artists, and people interested in art to actually confront or explore the idea of value in nature, specifically from the role of the art, from the artistic eye and from the arts perspective, and created through that effectively a manifesto from an arts-based perspective. So, for instance, you know, these are some of the statements we included in these policy documents. That the arts offers a distinctive understanding of the world and ourselves. It can provoke and it can unsettle norms and challenge prevailing wisdoms, that it can be political, that it can illuminate problems, that it can expose values and choices, that it can educate, inspire and persuade. It can offer up new perspectives through imagination. It can help us live with uncomfortable truth and help us adapt. And so these are sort of slogans or motifs or provocations that we've tried to, in a sense, pull out of these workshops, that can be statements about the way in which the arts and humanities can start to contribute and expand the kind of questions that sort of value in nature agendas, as I would call them in the UK, have historically developed. And crucially link that, because the thing that was always asked to us in these worlds is how that links to decision making, and how do these perspectives actually help decisions get made better. And through that work we've been able to look at historic reference points about the way in which the arts and art has absolutely influenced decision making in very significant ways. So for instance, the formation of the national parks in the United States, with the hanging up of art, great artwork, sublime landscapes, being to actually persuade congressmen about the value of sort of investing in nature. And these are obviously subtle relationships to decision making, but they're very, very important. And we know in the UK that our literary and artistic inheritance in the Lake District actually led to the formation of the national park, the National Trust, the custodian of these national assets. It came from these kind of literary associations with landscape. So actually seeing that actually the arts, humanities builds institutions and actually makes decisions in a sense subtly and indirectly, but quite powerfully, I think is very, very compelling. And I think it puts the sort of scientific knowledge in that wider sort of interpretive context, which I think is very, very powerful and important for people to hear. I mean, as a result of these sort of manifestos, these engagements, what's happened is this sort of sub-network in the Value in Nature programme, which was called ALERT, Arts and Artists in Landscape and Environmental Research Today. It's quite a busy acronym, but it led to being funded by the Arts and Humanities Council. That network got specifically funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council to develop this idea of the links between the arts and decision making, and is now actually probing that even further. So I think what you start to see is effectively a sort of a formula. You see a formula, and you see the way in which one area of funding starts to institutionalize another part of funding and creates a context for that discussion to happen in a different venue. But what you most notably see in the UK thing is this institutionalization of the arts humanity within these sort of science program, to actually sort of raise the standard. These projects which have interdisciplinary pretensions, but often start with quite simplistic assumptions. And so what we're seeing is a sort of maturing of that. So for instance, in the UK now, we have a big funding around the idea of treescapes, the future of treescapes. And that is, that basically the emphasis has even changed even stronger. That, in a sense, not so much as actually being arts and humanities led, but if you're not serious about your arts and humanities understanding, if you're not going beyond these simplistic motifs, you simply won't get anywhere with the funding at all. It's not like just inviting the arts and humanities in to help along. I mean, it is a serious element about confronting the full potential of the arts and humanities, from right up to project design. So moving towards fully collaborative, if not arts-led research within a scientific landscape. And that is, I think, what you're starting to see us move towards. So what I would say just finally is that, and these are simple summaries with essentially reinforcing points, I think the frameworks which we're working in, and you are with IPBES, they invite interdisciplinarity, but I think our experience is that does reveal immediately a nervousness, when it starts to bump up against humanities, and that comes from a lack of understanding, or maybe that will challenge the assumptions of these kinds of approaches. The fact of the matter is that, the more interdisciplinary you make your kind of frameworks, and if you ignore the arts and humanities, the harder those frameworks will fall. Not only will you not get funding, but actually you won't be able to answer the big questions, or how decisions are actually being dictated, which actually a lot of your answers are actually in this interpretive space. I mean, when in the UK a major decision is made on infrastructure, economic infrastructure, the minister will have the cost benefit analysis, and they will appeal for their gut instinct, how it will play with culture. And if you ignore that, you ignore a very important dimension of how decisions are made. So those frameworks will not have the purchase on the decision making they think, unless they ignore, if they ignore these important sort of disciplinary pathways in. And I think the UK is some evidence of how you can begin to institutionalize that in moderately authentic ways. Huh? That's it.
Great. Thank you so much for this really interesting overview of the developments over these years. That's really fascinating. And to see how, well, for myself at least, how the institutions and frameworks matter a lot in this respect. Yeah.